The key felt ice cold in my hand as I unlocked the heavy wooden door to my grandfather's Victorian house in Boston. The autumn wind whipped dead leaves around my feet as I stepped inside, bringing with them the musty scent of decay that seemed to have seeped into every corner of the old building. It had been 3 weeks since the funeral, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was disturbing something that should have been left alone. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I made my way through the dimly lit hallway. The electricity had been shut off days ago, and the weak afternoon sunlight filtering through the dusty windows cast long shadows across the faded wallpaper. My grandfather, Nikolai Petrov, had lived here alone for the past 20 years after my grandmother passed away, and now it fell to me to clean out the house and prepare it for sale. I never knew my grandfather well. He was always distant, lost in his own thoughts. The only time he ever seemed truly present was during those rare moments when he'd had too much vodka, and the stories would begin to flow. Stories of Leningrad during the siege, of hunger and cold and darkness. But even then, there were things he wouldn't speak of, memories that would make him fall silent and stare into space with haunted eyes. The basement door stood open, a black mouth leading down into darkness. I switched on my flashlight and began descending the wooden stairs, each step groaning under my weight. The beam of light danced across shelves lined with preserves and old medical books, remnants of my grandfather's life as a doctor before he fled the Soviet Union. As I moved deeper into the basement, the temperature seemed to drop precipitously. My breath came out in visible puffs, despite it being a mild October day above ground. The flashlight beam caught something unusual, a brick that protruded slightly from the wall, its mortar crumbling around the edges. I reached out to touch it, and the brick shifted easily under my fingers. Behind it was a small cavity, and within that space lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. The cover was unmarked except for a strange symbol that had been burned into the leather, a vertical line intersected by 3 wavy horizontals. When I pulled the journal from its hiding place, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The shadows in the corners of the basement seemed to deepen, to move in ways that shadows shouldn't. I quickly retreated upstairs, clutching the journal to my chest. In the kitchen, I laid the journal on the table and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with my grandfather's cramped handwriting in Russian, with strange symbols drawn in the margins. I recognized them as similar to the one on the cover, but more complex, more disturbing somehow. Though I couldn't read Russian fluently, I had enough knowledge from childhood lessons to recognize dates. The entries began in 1941. As I reached for my phone to use an online translation app, the device's screen flickered and went dark, despite being fully charged moments before. The sun had dipped below the horizon while I was in the basement, and the kitchen was growing dark. I lit several candles I had brought for just such a purpose, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. That's when I saw it, my reflection in the window, distorted by the old glass. For a moment, just a moment, there seemed to be something standing behind me, a tall, impossibly thin figure with hollow eyes. I spun around, heart pounding, but the kitchen was empty. With trembling hands, I began to translate the first entry. September 8th, 1941. The Germans have completely encircled the city. We thought we were prepared for this, but nothing could have prepared us for what I saw today in Ward 13. The patient in bed 6 was dying. We all knew it, had accepted it, as we must accept so many deaths these days. But what I saw feeding on him, no, I must be rational. I am a doctor. There must be a logical explanation for what these eyes witnessed. And yet, a sudden gust of wind extinguished all the candles at once, plunging the kitchen into darkness. In that moment of blackness, I heard something that turned my blood to ice, the sound of pages turning, though the journal lay closed before me. When I managed to relight the candles, the journal was indeed still closed, but it was no longer on the page I had left it. It had opened to an entry from the depths of winter, and a single line caught my eye before I slammed the book shut. It's following me home. God help me, it's following me home. My hands shook as I reopened the journal, this time to its original position. The candlelight seemed to grow dimmer as I began translating more entries, the shadows in the corners of the kitchen stretching impossibly long against the walls. The next entry I could make out was dated several days after the first. September 15th, 1941. The hospital is overwhelmed. Every day brings more casualties from the bombing raids, more civilians suffering from malnutrition, but that's not what keeps me awake at night. 3 more patients have vanished from Ward 13. The nurses say the ward was locked, all windows secured, yet somehow they disappeared without a trace. Orderly Mikhail swears he saw something in there last night. A figure standing between the beds, tall enough that its head nearly touched the ceiling. When he approached, it vanished. The other staff think the stress has broken him, but I've seen it too. The thing I witnessed that first night, I can describe it now. I must describe it, if only to prove to myself that I haven't lost my mind. It stood over the dying patient like a shadow given form, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its skin was like paper stretched over an empty frame, nearly translucent in the dim light. But its eyes, God, its eyes were endless black pits that seemed to swallow what little light remained in the room. As I watched, frozen in the doorway, it bent over the patient and seemed to inhale. The patient's body convulsed once, then lay still. When I finally found the courage to approach, the patient was dead, but more than dead. His body was a husk, dried and empty, as if something had drained every drop of life from him. The candle flames flickered violently, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Something brushed against my neck. A cold draft, I told myself, just a draft. But when I reached up to rub my neck, my fingers found marks like freezer burn on my skin. I forced myself to continue reading. The next legible entry was dated weeks later, and the handwriting had grown more frantic. October 3rd, 1941. I'm not alone in this anymore. Dr. Antonov has seen it too, and 2 of the nurses. We've begun meeting in secret, sharing what we know. Antonov found old books in the hospital's archive room, texts that speak of something similar during other sieges throughout history, always during times of great suffering, when people are at their weakest. It feeds not just on flesh and blood, but on despair itself. The old woman who works in the hospital kitchen, Baba Yekaterina, she knows more than she's telling. Today she cornered me in an empty corridor, pressed a small pouch of salt into my hand, and whispered, "It has chosen you, doctor. It will follow your bloodline now." Before I could question her further, she vanished into the shadows. The pouch sits on my desk as I write this, and I swear the salt inside is turning black. A loud thump from upstairs made me jump. My candles were burning low, and the darkness pressed in around the small circle of light. I knew I should leave, come back in daylight, but I couldn't stop reading. My grandfather's words seemed to hold me transfixed. October 10th, 1941. We found the tunnels today. They shouldn't exist. They don't appear on any hospital plans. But beneath Ward 13, behind a wall that crumbled at a touch, we discovered passages that extend deep underground. The walls are covered in carvings, ancient things that hurt the eyes to look at. Antonov insisted we explore them. God forgive me, I agreed. We found something down there, a chamber older than the hospital, older than the city itself, and on the walls. The entry ended abruptly, a dark stain obscuring the rest of the page. Above me, floorboards creaked with slow, deliberate steps. Someone, or something, was walking across the floor of my grandfather's study. The footsteps stopped directly overhead, and in the newfound silence, I could hear something else. The sound of deep, rattling breathing, like wind through an empty cavity. My phone lay dead on the table, and the darkness beyond my circle of candlelight seemed alive with movement. As I watched, paralyzed, a drop of black liquid fell from the ceiling, landing on the journal's open page. It wasn't water, it was too thick, too dark, and it moved across the paper like it had a will of its own, forming shapes that resembled the symbols in the margins. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but instead I turned the page with trembling fingers. The next entry was written in a different ink, darker, almost black-red in the candlelight. October 11th, 1941. What we found in the tunnel chamber will haunt me until my dying day. The walls were covered in murals, depicting the thing we'd seen, but not just in Leningrad. The images showed it present at every great catastrophe in the city's history: the Swedish siege of 1709, the floods of 1824, and before that, events so ancient the dates were lost to time. The creature has many names, many forms, but its nature remains constant. It feeds on human suffering, growing stronger as hope dies. The siege is making it powerful, more powerful than it's been in centuries. Antonov translated some of the text carved between the murals. They spoke of a ritual, a way to bind the entity, but the price. God help me, the price is too high. We were not alone in that chamber. We heard it before we saw it. A sound like thousands of voices whispering in pain. When it stepped into the light of our lanterns, I finally saw its true form. The creature was massive, its flesh translucent and shifting, containing the faces of everyone it had consumed. They pressed against its skin from the inside, mouths open in silent screams. Antonov went mad at the sight of it. He ran deeper into the tunnels, and the darkness swallowed him whole. I fled upstairs and sealed the tunnel entrance, but I know it can still get out. There are other ways up from those depths, and it has had centuries to learn them all. Another drop of black liquid fell, this time landing on my hand. It burned like acid, and I stifled a scream as I wiped it away. The footsteps overhead had stopped, but something worse had replaced them. A slow, scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The next entry was dated weeks later, the handwriting barely legible. November 2nd, 1941. The hospital is hell now. The entity no longer hides in shadows. It walks the wards openly, wearing the faces of those it has taken. Only a few of us can see it for what it really is. The others. They see what it wants them to see. It appears to the starving as loved ones offering bread. To the freezing, it promises warmth. But those who accept its offers are never seen again. Baba Yekaterina told me more before she disappeared. The entity marks certain bloodlines, following them through generations, feeding on their descendants' fear. She gave me a bundle of papers, ancient notes passed down through her family for centuries. They describe a way to break its hold. But the ritual requires 3 things: the blood of the marked, the true name of the entity, and a sacrifice I cannot bring myself to write down. The papers are hidden now, behind the 3rd brick from the floor, beneath the east window of my home. If you're reading this, it means the entity has followed me as I feared it would. Find those papers, learn its name, and whatever you do, don't look into its eyes. That's how it takes hold, The entry cut off mid-sentence. The rest of the page was blank except for a single dark handprint, smaller than my grandfather's would have been. The scraping sound above had stopped. In its place came a new sound, slow, heavy footsteps on the stairs leading down to the kitchen. The candles guttered, their flames turning in sickly blue color. The temperature plummeted until I could see my breath clouding in front of my face. Something was coming down those stairs, something huge. I could hear the wood groaning under its weight, could smell a sickly sweet odor like rotting flowers and old blood. The shadows in the corners began to move, to flow together like spilled ink, forming a darkness deeper than mere absence of light. My body was frozen, whether from terror or something more supernatural, I couldn't tell. All I could do was watch as a massive shape began to emerge from the darkness of the stairwell. First came a hand, pale as death and impossibly long, its fingers ending in translucent points that scraped against the wall. Then an arm that seemed to stretch and twist in ways that human limbs should not be able to move. I wanted to close my eyes, remembering my grandfather's warning, but I couldn't. I could only stare as the thing pulled itself fully into view, its body a writhing mass of trapped faces and limbs, all pressing against its skin like insects trapped under ice. Its head nearly touched the ceiling, and where its face should have been, there was only a dark void that seemed to swallow all light. The entity paused, swaying slightly, and then its void face turned toward me. Somewhere within that darkness, points of cold light began to flicker like dying stars, and I realized with horror that they were eyes, hundreds of eyes, all opening at once, all fixing their gaze upon me. In that moment, I heard my grandfather's voice in my head, clear as day. Don't look into its eyes. With every ounce of willpower I possessed, I wrenched my gaze away and dove for the kitchen door. The entity made a sound like 1,000 whispers merging into one terrible scream, and the remaining candles went out. I ran through the darkness, my hands outstretched, bouncing off walls as I tried to remember the layout of the house. Behind me, I could hear it moving, not pursuing exactly, but flowing through the house like black water, filling every space with its presence. The air grew thick with that sickly sweet smell, and I could hear voices calling out to me in Russian, promising warmth, food, safety, everything a person in Siege would have desperately wanted. My shoulder slammed into the doorframe of my grandfather's study and I stumbled inside. Moonlight filtered through the east window and I remembered the journal entry, the third brick from the floor. I dropped to my knees, feeling along the wall with trembling fingers. The brick moved slightly under my touch. The entity's presence filled the doorway behind me, its massive faces all whispering now, some weeping, others laughing. I could feel its cold radiating against my back as I pried the brick free. Inside the small cavity was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a leather cord. A long, pale hand reached past my head, its fingers spreading across the wall like pale spider legs. Another hand emerged on my other side, boxing me in. The whispers grew louder, and I felt something cold and wet drip onto the back of my neck. The entity was bent over me, its void face inches from my head. With shaking hands, I untied the cord and opened the oilcloth. Inside were pages of different ages, some yellow and brittle, others newer but stained with substances I didn't want to identify. The topmost page was covered in text written in several different hands, as if multiple people had contributed to it over centuries. At the bottom was my grandfather's handwriting. To my grandchild, if you're reading this, then it has found you. The entity's true name is written below, but speaking it has a price. It will draw its attention immediately, and the speaker will be marked forever. But names have power, and knowing its name gives you a chance to fight back. The ritual requires 3 elements: the name, the blood of the marked, and a sacrifice of memory, specifically the memory of everyone who has ever seen its true form. If the ritual succeeds, the entity will be bound for another century, but all record and memory of its existence will be erased from the minds of the living. The entity's hands were moving closer, its fingers elongating like melting wax. The faces in its flesh pressed forward, and I recognized some of them from old family photographs. Distant relatives who had disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. One face in particular caught my eye: Antonov, my grandfather's colleague, his features frozen in an eternal scream. Below my grandfather's note was a single word written in characters that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. They hurt my eyes to read, like trying to stare at the sun, but I knew, somehow, that this was the entity's true name. The thing behind me began to straighten up, drawing itself to its full height. As it moved, I caught a glimpse of something in the moonlight that made my blood run cold. More faces emerging from its flesh, but these were fresh. I recognized my neighbors, the ones who had gone missing in the weeks before my grandfather's death. I had a choice to make. I could try to run, but I knew in my heart there was no escaping it now. It had marked my bloodline long ago in Leningrad, and it would keep hunting us, generation after generation. Or I could read the name, begin the ritual, and accept whatever consequences came with that decision. The entity's hands were almost touching me now. The air had grown so cold that frost was forming on the windows. From somewhere deep in the house, I heard the sound of my grandfather's journal hitting the floor, its pages rustling as if blown by an unfelt wind. I made my decision. Drawing blood would be easy. The brick had cut my palm when I pulled it from the wall. The name burned in my mind, trying to slip away like a nightmare upon waking, but I held on to it. As for the sacrifice of memory, I could only hope that part would take care of itself. I pressed my bleeding palm against the papers and began to read the name. The characters seemed to squirm and twist on the page, resisting my efforts to speak them. Behind me, the entity went perfectly still. The whispers stopped. Even the faces trapped within its flesh froze in mid-scream. The name felt like glass in my mouth, cutting and sharp, but I forced it out. Each syllable dropped into the frozen air like stones into a dark pool. With each sound, the entity shuddered, its form becoming less stable, more fluid. The faces in its flesh began to wail, not in pain or fear, but in recognition. They knew this name. They had known it all along but had been unable to speak it. Suddenly, the entity moved. Its hands shot forward, wrapping around my throat with fingers like ice. It lifted me off the ground, turning me to face it. The void where its face should have been began to fill with a pale light, and within that light, I saw something that defied comprehension, a glimpse of what it truly was, beyond the forms it wore to walk among humans. I saw endless corridors of flesh and bone, twisting through dimensions that shouldn't exist. I saw cities built from suffering and towers made of frozen screams. I saw the true history of Leningrad's siege, how the entity had whispered to both sides, encouraging the Germans to encircle the city, pushing the Soviets to hold out beyond reason, feeding on the misery it created. But most terribly, I saw my grandfather's last moments, how the entity had come for him, wearing the faces of all those he'd failed to save in that hospital ward, how he'd fought it one last time, using his own death to set up this very moment, this chance for someone to end it. The entity's grip tightened, and I felt my consciousness starting to fade, but I wasn't finished. With the last of my strength, I spoke the final words of the ritual, the ones written in my grandfather's hand at the bottom of the page. I offer freely what was taken by force, the memories of your existence, the knowledge of your name, the truth of what happened in Ward 13. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The entity's form began to collapse in on itself, its flesh turning transparent, then gaseous. The faces trapped within it began to dissolve, but not in terror, they were smiling. One by one they were forgetting, letting go, finally free. The entity's grip on my throat loosened as its hands began to lose cohesion. It tried to pull back, to retreat into the shadows, but the ritual had taken hold. Where before it had been solid enough to touch, now it was like smoke in a strong wind. The void face turned toward me one last time, and in it, I saw something I never expected: fear. The room filled with a light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The entity's form was torn apart, shredding like paper in a storm. As it disintegrated, I felt memories beginning to slip away. Not just my own, but generations of memories. The siege, the hospital, the things that happened in Ward 13. All of it beginning to fade like old photographs left in the sun. I collapsed to the floor as the light reached its peak intensity. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was the entity's final form. Not a monster, not a demon, but something ancient and lonely, a being that had forgotten its own true name so long ago that it had to steal the memories of others to remember what it once was. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the study windows. The walls were clear of frost, and the air smelled of dust and old books. I found myself holding a bundle of blank papers and an empty journal. There was a brick out of place in the wall, but I couldn't remember why I had removed it. The doctors called it selective amnesia. They couldn't explain why I had gaps in my memory, spanning not just my own experiences, but my knowledge of family history as well. I knew my grandfather had lived through the Siege of Leningrad, but the details were gone, like trying to remember a dream that slips away upon waking. In the weeks that followed, I discovered others with similar gaps. While cleaning out my grandfather's house, I found old letters mentioning a Dr. Antonov, but nobody at the Leningrad hospital had any record of him ever working there. The hospital's archives had no information about Ward 13, though architectural plans showed it must have existed at some point. But some things remained. Every night, I dream of cold corridors and whispered voices. I dream of a name I can no longer speak, written in characters I can no longer read. Sometimes, looking in mirrors or windows, I catch glimpses of faces I almost recognize, pressed against the glass like insects in amber. They're smiling now, though I don't know why. The ritual took our memories, but it left echoes. I find myself avoiding dark places, though I can't explain why they frighten me. I keep salt by my bedside, and my hands shake when I hear whispers in empty rooms. Sometimes, on cold nights, I wake up feeling like something is watching me, its gaze full of ancient hunger and endless patience. My grandfather's house sold quickly, though the new owners complain about cold spots in the study and strange noises in the walls. They've sealed up the basement, claiming it feels wrong somehow. I didn't tell them about the brick I replaced, or the empty journal I left behind it. Some part of me knows that in 100 years, someone else might find it, might need it, even if I can't remember why. Last week I received a letter from a historian in St. Petersburg asking about my grandfather's experiences during the siege. I tried to respond, but found I couldn't write about it. Not because the memories were too painful, but because they simply weren't there. Instead, I sent him the only concrete fact I still possessed. A list of names, people who disappeared from the hospital during those dark years. I don't know why I kept this list or what happened to the people on it, but it feels important somehow. The historian wrote back with an interesting observation. Every person on that list had descendants who disappeared under mysterious circumstances generations later. The most recent disappearances stopped abruptly 3 months ago, around the time I found myself holding blank papers in my grandfather's study. Sometimes I stand at my window at night, looking out at the city lights, and I feel something vast and ancient looking back. Not with malice now, but with something like respect, or perhaps resignation. The entity may be bound, but it isn't gone. Nothing that old ever truly dies. It just waits, gathering strength, until the seals weaken and the memories fade enough for it to try again. But that's a problem for another generation, another time. My role in this story is over, even if I can't quite remember what that role was. All I know is that when I visit my grandfather's grave, I understand the strange words carved on his headstone in a way I never did before. The price of forgetting is less than the cost of remembering. I leave fresh flowers there every week, though I couldn't tell you why I feel compelled to do so. And if sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I see a tall, thin figure standing among the headstones, well, that's just another thing I've learned to forget. The dreams will fade with time, the doctors say. The gaps in my memory might fill themselves in, or they might not. But late at night, when the wind howls and the shadows grow long, I find myself grateful for those empty spaces in my mind. Some things are better left forgotten, some names better left unspoken. After all, there are older and stranger things in this world than we dare remember. They live in the spaces between memories, in the shadows between moments, in the cold places where light fears to tread. And sometimes, the only way to survive them is to forget they ever existed at all.